Everything you're talking about is incredibly complex, and there's a lot of really, really smart people working on it. And there's a lot of people who are doing it for what I'll call kind of the right reasons, in terms of they want to make a difference, they want to increase life, they want to have people live healthier lives. There's also people who are doing it from a for-profit kind of perspective, and profit is kind of the number one thing that they're focused on. Neither do I think that you nor Christian believe that those two things have to be mutually exclusive. Like, I actually think that there's a world here where you could take a capitalistic perspective, and the capitalism or the pursuit of profits actually drives revenue, which then can be reinvested to further kind of the health impact, and probably is the most sustainable model that we've seen so far. But you guys have a spin or kind of a variation of how to finance a lot of this work. And one of the things that I think is fascinating to me is that most of the people in this space come from the science side, right? They look at it from a very scientific perspective, and there's a constant cat and mouse game. How do I get funding? How do I get a grant? How do I get some level of financial kind of backing so that I can actually spend time both mentally and kind of with resources to actually make an impact? You guys are looking at this in kind of this drug discovery company model. So maybe talk a little bit about this DISCO, DISCO, that you guys talk about a lot, and then talk through what are the variations or changes that you think of from a financing perspective that should lead to kind of a better outcome and a more kind of sustainable platform.
Yeah. So there's a lot of threads that I can pick up from there. But maybe before we jump deep into the DISCO model, I want to just emphasize one of the pieces that you're talking about around like doing this for the right reasons, kind of how drug discovery in general works, because there are a few different ways that people have been doing this. And I think that, as you articulated, the biggest problem for folks trying to think about developing a drug for anything is the funding question. That a lot of drugs that start clinical trials ultimately end up failing, and that those failures are usually very expensive to figure out, because it takes tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars to run a phase 1, then a phase 2, and then a phase 3 clinical trial. We've seen that with the COVID vaccines that everyone has paid attention to. These are incredibly expensive human experiments to run. And so one of the cool things about the pharmaceutical industry as it exists in the free market, for all of its flaws, and it has many, is that once you start going down a path that's going to cost $100 million plus to get you from an idea stage to an approved drug, that at the end of that, it really never makes sense to start to say like, oh, well, this is just going to be for one small group of people, right? That you actually want to get those drugs to as many people as possible at the right price. And so there's this old joke in the pharma industry that it takes $1 billion to make your first pill, and it takes a fraction of a penny to make your second one. And that what that means for supply and demand curves is that when a medicine is applicable to a large fraction of the population, it drives the price way, way, way down. And so the closest thing that exists today to what we would think of as one of these geroprotective or age-slowing drugs is actually the drug Lipitor. So these statins that reduce cholesterol. That's the closest equivalent to what's been on the market so far. And those drugs at their highest point never cost more than $4 or $5 a day, right? And it was the most profitable drug of all time because it reached so many people. And so when we think about doing this for the right reasons and kind of like the mixing and matching of the profit motive with drug development, I think there is actually kind of a positive story there. So I just wanted to pick up on that thread. The second piece that you talked about is, as it relates to how we fund drug development today, we've actually been in this really interesting quiet revolution where two things are changing a lot in science. And the first part is that universities and like academic research scientists, because of all of the genetic sequencing tools and like advances in chemistry, advances in genetics that have been happening, so you can do so much more now in a university lab than you could 20 or 30 years ago, as far as making a drug. And so almost all, like the majority of new drugs are actually discovered at universities, spun out into biotech companies, and then are eventually acquired by big pharmaceutical companies that do the late stage clinical trials. Because this is working so well, on the flip side, the big pharma companies are actually powering down their R&D and relying more and more on gobbling up through M&A these small research companies, right? And so the intersection of those two things means that there's tons of good ideas inside of academia that need to do the research and development work to prove to a big pharma player that their idea is worth a damn. And so they're constantly fighting for funding. And so the VCs, the funders have kind of become the gatekeepers in this. And you have this really kind of messy mixture of like CEOs coming into a biotech company, pitching a VC to try to get funding, and then, getting a little bit of data, pitching more VCs, bringing more in until you can kind of like finally roll a big enough snowball to get absorbed by a pharma company. But it's really messy. It involves a lot of hype generation and like a lot of like who sort of conversations. And ultimately what we've seen is that it can get disconnected from the value of the underlying science. And so when Christian and I came into this field, what we wanted to do was build an organization that could have the scale to take a lot of different shots on goal so that some of them would ultimately succeed. And then at the individual asset development level, make our decisions exclusively based on the quality of the science, not on how hyped it was or what the last valuation was or who had invested before. And so with Cambrian, we've been able to like absorb almost 15 different projects that started at universities into our umbrella. And now we can continue to resource the ones that are working with more and more money to kind of get them into clinical trials. And if an idea fails, like that's a tough message to deliver to that team, but it's better for us as the ultimate, like the organization that's footing the bill, to make that decision early instead of trying to pull more and more capital and like hype it up, try to like get it out the door and then have it ultimately fall on its face. And so that's a bit of a lecture on this, and we can go deeper or stay at a higher level as how this model works, but changing those incentives around so that I can talk to my ultimate investors and not have to sell them a bill of goods around how this one technology is going to change the world, but instead say, hey, look, we have this thesis around how we're going to create this new category of preventative or proactive medicines targeting the hallmarks of aging. And if you believe that this hypothesis has merit to it, we're going to take enough shots on goal to get 1, 2, 3, 4 things working, and we don't need every single project to ultimately be the golden goose. I think that's a very powerful idea.